growth does not happen simply because time passes. Time is neutral, it does not improve anyone by default. What time does it reveal? What a person has chosen repeatedly. If a person chooses discipline, time amplifies discipline. If a person chooses distraction, time amplifies confusion. If a person chooses learning, time amplifies wisdom. If a person chooses avoidance, time amplifies stagnation. This is why two people can live the same number of years and yet exist in completely different levels of reality. One has been intentional with growth, the other has been passive with life. Intentional growth is the dividing line between those who remain stuck and those who evolve. Stagnation often continues not because people lack ability, but because they lack structure. They have desires without systems, motivation without consistency, and dreams without daily frameworks. But growth is not emotional, it is architectural. It is built through repeated decisions that align with the desired future, not current feelings. Many people misunderstand growth as something dramatic, like a sudden breakthrough or a major external change. But real growth is often quiet. It is found in the unseen discipline, need of showing up when no one is watching. It is found in choosing study over distraction, reflection over reaction, patience over impulse. It is built in moments that feel small but accumulate into something powerful over time. The tragedy is that many people underestimate these small moments, and because they ignore them, they also ignore their own transformation. At the center of stagnation is inconsistency. A person may do something powerful one day and then abandon it the next. They may feel inspired in one moment and then return to old patterns in the next. This cycle creates emotional instability and prevents depth from forming. Growth requires repetition, not occasional effort, but sustained commitment. Anything valuable in life demands consistency long enough for roots to develop. The human mind, however, resists consistency because consistency feels boring before it becomes rewarding. The early stages of discipline rarely produce excitement. In fact, they often feel like resistance. When someone begins to change their habits, there is an internal friction because the mind is adjusting to a new identity. Old habits try to reclaim attention. Old emotions try to pull the person back. Old environments try to reassert influence. This is why many people quit right before transformation begins. They confuse discomfort with failure. But discomfort is not failure, it is recalibration. It is the mind being rewired. It is identity being reshaped. It is the internal system adjusting to a higher standard. Every time a person resists distraction, they are strengthening focus. Every time they resist procrastination, they are strengthening discipline. Every time they choose structure over chaos, they are building a new internal order. Growth is not a single event, it is the accumulation of these internal victories. One of the most critical elements of growth is decision-making. A person's life is not shaped by what they think occasionally, but by what they decide repeatedly. Decisions are the steering wheel of destiny. Yet many people make decisions emotionally instead of intentionally. They decide based on how they feel in the moment rather than where they want to be in the future. This creates instability because emotions fluctuate, but purpose should remain constant. Intentional growth requires that decisions be anchored in vision, not emotion. It's clear, discipline becomes easier. When direction is defined, sacrifice becomes meaningful. Without vision, effort feels like suffering. With vision, effort feels like investment. This is why stagnation often comes with confusion, because without clarity, every effort feels random, and randomness cannot produce progression. Another key aspect of growth is environment. No one grows in isolation from influence. The environment a person consistently engages with either accelerates or resists their development. This includes people, information, conversations, and daily exposure. An environment that reinforces limitation will eventually shape belief. An environment that reinforces expansion will eventually shape possibility. Many people try to change their lives without changing their environment, and this is why they experience repeated cycles. They attempt to build discipline in spaces that encourage distraction. They try to develop focus in environments that reward noise. They try to grow in places that constantly pull them backward. This creates internal conflict because the desire for growth is constantly competing with environmental reinforcement of stagnation. To grow intent, a person must become selective about influence. Not everything deserves attention. Not every voice deserves access. Not every habit deserves continuation. Growth requires pruning. It requires removing what no longer supports expansion. even if it is familiar or emotionally comfortable. This process is not always easy, but it is necessary. Another truth about growth is that it demands responsibility. Many people remain stagnant because they externalize blame. They blame timing, people, systems, opportunities, or circumstances. While external factors do exist, responsibility determines response. Two people can face the same limitation, but only one uses it as a reason to stop, while the other uses it as a reason to develop strategy. Growth begins when blame ends. Responsibility does not mean ignoring challenges, it means owning response. It means acknowledging that while you may not control everything that happens, you control what you do with what happens. This shift in thinking is powerful because it moves a person from victimhood into agency. And agency is the foundation of transformation. Intentional growth also requires patience with process. Modern thinking often promotes instant results, but deep transformation cannot be rushed. Anything deeply rooted takes time to build. A tree does not become strong overnight, it grows through seasons of pressure, weather changes and time. In the same way, a person's strength is developed through cycles of testing, learning and adjustment. The mistake many people make is abandoning the process because early results are not visible. But invisibility does not mean inactivity. Some of the most important changes happen internally before they appear externally. Character is formed before opportunity arrives. Capacity is built before responsibility increases. Structure is developed before expansion manifests. To grow intentionally is to trust the process even when progress is not yet visible. It is to remain committed when motivation fades. It is to continue building when recognition is absent. It is to understand that consistency in unseen seasons is what produces visible transformation in due time. Ultimately, intentional growth is a decision to live differently from yesterday. It is the refusal to remain the same version of yourself year after year. It is the courage to confront habits that no longer serve your future. It is the discipline to choose long-term development over short-term comfort. And it is the awareness that your life will only rise to the level of your daily decisions. When growth becomes intentional, stagnation loses power. Because stagnation survives in unconscious living, but it cannot survive in a life governed by awareness, structure, and disciplined progression. Comfort is one of the most deceptive forces in human development. It does not announce itself as danger. It does not feel like limitation. In fact, it often feels like peace, stability, and safety. But beneath that surface, comfort can become a silent cage that slowly reduces a person's capacity for growth. Many people are not failing because they are incapable. They are stagnant because they have become too familiar with what no longer challenges them. Comfort zones are not always negative in the beginning. They are formed through repetition, through routines, environments, and behaviors that once helped a person survive, adapt, or stabilize. At some point in life, what you call a comfort zone may have actually been a rescue zone. It protected you during uncertainty. It gave you structure during chaos. It helped you maintain emotional or financial balance when things were unstable. But the problem begins when what once protected you starts limiting you and you no longer recognize the transition. One of the greatest dangers of comfort zones is that they are invisible from the inside. A person inside a limitation rarely feels limited. They feel normal. They feel adjusted. They feel okay. This is why stagnation can last for years without confrontation. The mind adapts to repetition so well that it begins to redefine limitation as normality. And once limitation becomes normal, the desire to break it weakens. But life does not reward comfort, it responds to growth. Every meaningful level of progress requires movement beyond what feels familiar. Growth always begins where comfort ends. This is not just a motivational idea, it is a structural reality of human development. Muscles only grow when they are stressed beyond their current capacity. Minds only expand when exposed to new thinking. Opportunities only appear when a person moves beyond known territory. The reason many people remain stuck is not because they do not desire change, but because they are emotionally attached to. Familiar environments feel safe even when they are unproductive. Familiar routines feel secure even when they are unfruitful. Familiar relationships feel stable even when they are limiting. This emotional attachment becomes a barrier to transformation because it creates resistance against necessary change. Breaking out of comfort zones requires courage, but not just emotional courage, it requires disciplined courage. Emotional courage may feel strong in a moment of inspiration, but disciplined courage continues even when inspiration fades. It is easy to want change when you are motivated. It is harder to maintain change when discomfort begins. And every comfort zone will resist disruption at the beginning. When a person begins to challenge their comfort zone, there is usually internal resistance. The mind will attempt to rationalize staying the same. It will produce thoughts like, this is enough, you don't need more, or you should avoid risk. These thoughts are not always wrong in general life situations, but in the context of stagnation, they become protective mechanisms that defend limitation. The mind prefers predictability over expansion because predictability feels safe even when it is small. But destiny does not operate within the boundaries of comfort. Expansion requires exposure. A person cannot discover new capacity while remaining in the same environment that constantly affirms old limitations. At some point, growth demands disruption. It demands stepping into unfamiliar situations where previous experience is not enough, where learning becomes immediate, and where dependence on old patterns is no longer sufficient. This is where many people hesitate, not because they lack vision, but because they fear instability. They fear losing control. They fear making mistakes. They fear being seen as inexperienced. But growth cannot coexist with complete control. There will always be a phase where you feel unprepared. There will always be a stage where you feel stretched beyond your comfort. That is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that development is happening. Comfort zones also maintain themselves through repetition. The more a behavior is repeated, the stronger the attachment becomes. This is why breaking out of stagnation requires not only a decision, but a replacement. You cannot simply remove a habit, you must replace it with a stronger structure. If not, the mind will return to what is familiar. Nature resists emptiness. Whatever is removed must be replaced with intentional discipline. For example, if a person removes distraction but does not replace it with focus-building routines, distraction returns. If a person removes procrastination but does not replace it with structured planning, procrastination returns. If a person leaves a limiting environment but does not build a new supportive one, the old patterns will eventually pull them back. Transformation is not just about breaking out, it is about building within. Another truth about comfort zones is that they shrink potential over time. When a person avoids challenge repeatedly, their capacity for challenge weakens. What was once difficult becomes impossible, not because ability is gone, but because it was unused. Capacity that is not exercised begins to decline. This is why some people feel stuck even though opportunities exist. They have not trained themselves to handle expansion. Comfort also affects identity. Over time, a person begins to associate themselves with their environment. If the environment is small, identity becomes small. If the environment is limited, identity becomes limited. This is why people often struggle to see themselves beyond their current situation. They are not just in a comfort zone physically, they are in an identity zone mentally. An identity is one of the strongest forces in human behavior. To break comfort zones, identity must be challenged before circumstances change. A person must begin to see themselves differently before life reflects something different. This internal shift is often uncomfortable because it requires letting go of old definitions. It requires accepting that who you have been is not the full expression of who you can become. The breaking point of comfort comes when dissatisfaction becomes stronger than fear. As long as fear is stronger, a person will stay where they are. But when internal dissatisfaction grows, when a person becomes tired of repetition, tired of limitation, tired of cycles, that discomfort becomes fuel for change. Dissatisfaction, when directed properly, becomes one of the strongest catalysts for transformation. However, dissatisfaction alone is not enough. It must be combined with action. Many people feel frustrated with their comfort zones but do not. Think differently, they recognize the limitation but remain inside it. Real change begins when awareness turns into movement. Even small movement outside comfort begins to weaken its hold. Leaving comfort zones also requires patience because new environments feel unstable at first. The unfamiliar does not provide immediate emotional reward. It often feels harder before it feels better. But this is part of restructuring. The brain needs time to adapt to new patterns. Emotional systems need time to adjust to new expectations. Stability comes after repetition, not before it. In conclusion, comfort zones are not broken by force alone. They are broken by decision, discipline, and sustained movement into unfamiliar territory. They are dismantled when a person decides that safety is no longer the highest value, growth is. And once that decision is made consistently, comfort loses its authority. Because in the end, comfort may preserve your current state, but it will never produce your next level. Frustration is often misunderstood. Many people interpret it as a negative emotional state that should be avoided, suppressed, or ignored. But in reality, frustration can be one of the most powerful, full signals of transformation when properly understood. It is not simply emotional discomfort. It is evidence that your internal desire for change has begun to outgrow your current environment, habits, or level of living. There is a stage in every person's life where frustration becomes unavoidable. It happens when repetition meets awareness. When a person begins to notice that their life is cycling in patterns, same results, same struggles, same limitations, something inside begins to resist acceptance. That resistance is frustration. It is the inner protest against stagnation. It is the mind saying this is no longer acceptable. But frustration alone does not change anything. Many people remain frustrated for years without transformation because they misinterpret its purpose. They either vent it without direction, suppress it out of fear, or allow it to turn into bitterness. Yet frustration is not meant to destroy you, it is meant to awaken you. It is an indicator, not a destination. In the journey out of stagnation, frustration plays a critical role because it begins to shift priority. When life is comfortable, growth feels optional. When life is stable, change feels unnecessary. But when frustration builds, comfort begins to lose its appeal. What once felt fine starts to feel insufficient. What once felt acceptable begins to feel restrictive. This is the beginning of internal reevaluation. At this stage, a silent battle begins between fear and frustration. Fear is the voice of preservation. It says, stay where you are, avoid risk, maintain control. Do not disrupt what you already understand. Fear is not always irrational, it is protective by design. But in stagnation, fear becomes overactive. It begins to protect not just safety, but limitation. It starts defending patterns that no longer serve growth. Frustration, on the other hand, is the voice of expansion. It says, there is more. You cannot remain here forever. You were not designed for repetition without progress. Frustration challenges the boundaries that fear tries to preserve. It pushes against the walls that comfort has built. And when frustration becomes stronger than fear, change becomes inevitable. This is the turning point of transformation. Not inspiration, not motivation, not an external opportunity, but internal pressure. Because pressure forces decision, and decision is where real change begins. However, many people mismanage this moment. Instead of allowing frustration to guide them into structured action, they allow it to become emotional chaos. They react instead of respond. They complain instead of construct. They speak about change but do not build toward it. This is why frustration without direction leads to burnout instead of breakthrough. To use frustration correctly, it must be converted into clarity. The question is not why am I frustrated, but what is this frustration revealing? Frustration is often pointing to misalignment. It is showing where life has stopped evolving. It is highlighting the gap between current reality and desired direction. When interpreted correctly, frustration becomes a map, not a burden. Another important truth is that fear and frustration often coexist. A person may feel both at the same time, fear of change and frustration with staying the same. This internal tension is uncomfortable, but it is also powerful. It means transformation is near. Because when both forces are active, it means the old identity is weakening while the new possibility is emerging. The mistake many people make at this stage is choosing because it feels safer. They prioritize short-term emotional comfort over long-term growth. They convince themselves that patience means staying the same, when in reality, patience and stagnation without movement becomes delay. True patience is active. It continues building even while waiting. Frustration increases when potential is not fulfilled. Every human being has a sense of internal capacity and knowing that they can become more, do more, achieve more. When that capacity is not expressed, tension builds internally. That tension is frustration. It is not random, it is directional. It is pointing toward unused potential. This is why some of the most transformative moments in life come from dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction is not the enemy, it is often the beginning of clarity. A person who is too comfortable rarely questions their direction. But a person who becomes dissatisfied begins to seek answers. And seeking is the first step toward discovery. But seeking alone is not enough. There must be action attached to insight. Frustration must move from internal pressure to external structure. Otherwise, it remains stuck in the emotional realm. Real transformation requires that frustration be translated into discipline, new habits, new decisions, new environments, and new commitments. It is also important to understand that frustration will intensify before breakthrough. This is because as you begin to resist stagnation, the systems that maintained it will resist back. Old habits will become louder. Old distractions will become more appealing. Old fears will become more convincing. This is not a sign to stop. It is a sign that change is threatening the old system. Many people quit at this stage because they misinterpret resistance as failure. But resistance is often confirmation that something is shifting. Nothing significant changes without resistance. Even nature demonstrates this principle. Pressure precedes expansion. Resistance precedes strength. The key is not to eliminate fear or frustration, but to prioritize correctly. Fear asks you to preserve what is familiar. Frustration asks you to pursue what is possible. One protects your past, the other invites your future. The question is not which one exists, it is which one leads your decisions. When frustration becomes mature, it stops being emotional chaos and becomes strategic focus. It stops expressing itself through complaint and begins expressing itself through action. It becomes organized dissatisfaction, energy directed toward change instead of noise. At this level, frustration transforms into vision. And vision is what ultimately breaks stagnation. Because vision gives direction to emotional energy. Without vision, frustration is scattered. With vision, frustration becomes fuel. In conclusion, frustration is not a weakness, it is a warning and an invitation. It warns you that your current state is no longer sufficient, and it invites you into a higher level of action and awareness. But whether it becomes destructive or transformative depends entirely on how it is handled. If you allow frustration to control you, it will drain you. But if you allow it to direct you, it will develop you. And in the journey of breaking stagnation, frustration is not the enemy, it is often the very force that pushes you toward your next level. Identity is the hidden foundation of every result a person produces. Before a person's life changes externally, something must first shift internally in how they see themselves. This is why two individuals can receive the same opportunity, the same info, even the same environment, yet produce completely different outcomes. The difference is not always skill or resources, it is identity. Most people focus on changing their situation while leaving their identity untouched. They want new results with an old self-concept. But life does not respond primarily to what you want, it responds to who you believe you are. Your identity acts like a silent governor on your behavior. It sets the boundaries of what you will attempt, what you will tolerate, and what you will persist in. If identity remains small, behavior will remain small, regardless of potential. Stagnation is often not a lack of opportunity, it is a conflict of identity. A person may intellectually desire growth, but subconsciously still identify with limitation. They may say, I want more, but internally still operate as someone who expects less. This contradiction creates resistance. It produces inconsistency, hesitation, and self-sabotage. Because whenever behavior begins to exceed identity, the mind attempts to pull it back into alignment with what feels normal. This is why lasting transformation cannot begin with action alone. Action without identity shift is temporary. It may create short-term change, but it will eventually collapse under internal pressure. A person can force new habits for a while, but if those habits are not supported by a new identity, they will feel unnatural, exhausting, and unsustainable. Real transformation begins when identity is rewritten. When a person stops asking, what do I want to achieve? And begins asking, who must I become to sustain this level? That question shifts focus from external pursuit to internal formation. It moves growth from performance to becoming. Becoming is deeper than doing. Doing can be copied, becoming cannot. Doing can be imitated for a season, becoming defines consistency. This is why identity is so powerful, it governs behavior without constant effort. When identity is aligned, discipline feels natural. When identity is misaligned, discipline feels like struggle. One of the strongest signs of identity stagnation is internal contradiction. A person may desire discipline but still see themselves as inconsistent. They may desire success but still internally associate themselves with failure or limitation. These internal labels are powerful because they shape expectation. And expectation shapes behavior before conscious decision even occurs. Expectation is what the mind anticipates as normal outcome. If a person expects failure, they unconsciously prepare for it. If they expect delay, they tolerate it. If they expect struggle, they normalize it. This is how identity silently constructs experience. It filters perception, influences interpretation, and shapes response. To break stagnation, identity must be challenged at its root. This does not mean denial of reality, but redefinition of possibility. A person must begin to see themselves not based on where they are, but based on what they are capable of becoming. This shift is uncomfortable because it disrupts familiarity. It requires letting go of old labels that may have been reinforced for years. Many people are still living according to identities formed by past experiences, failures, rejections, limitations, or environments that once shaped them. But those experiences were not meant to define identity, they were meant to develop awareness. When a person confuses experience with identity, they become trapped in their history. They begin to interpret their past as a permanent definition rather than a chapter. Identity transformation begins with separation from outdated definitions. It requires the courage to no longer introduce yourself internally by your limitations. Instead of saying, I am someone who struggles with consistency, identity transformation begins to say, I am becoming disciplined. This may feel simple, but internally it is powerful because language reinforces self-perception. However, identity change is not about positive thinking alone. It is about reinforced action that aligns with a new internal narrative. When a person begins to consistently act in alignment with a new identity, even in small ways, the mind starts to accept that identity as real. Repetition becomes evidence. Evidence becomes belief. And belief becomes behavior. This is why small, consistent actions are more powerful than large occasional efforts. Small actions may seem insignificant, but they are identity builders. Every disciplined choice reinforces a new version of self. Every avoided distraction strengthens focus identity. Every completed task reinforces reliability. Over time, these small actions accumulate into a completely different internal structure. One of the major reasons people remain stuck is because they wait to feel like a new person before acting differently. But identity does not change before behavior, it changes through behavior. Waiting to feel ready keeps a person locked in their current version. Growth begins when action leads and identity follows. At some point, every person must confront the gap between who they are and who they are becoming. That gap can feel uncomfortable because it highlights inconsistency. But that discomfort is not meant to discourage it, is meant to direct attention. It reveals where alignment is needed. Another key truth about identity is that it resists contradiction. If a person repeatedly acts outside their current identity, internal tension builds. That tension can either lead to regression or transformation. If they return to old behavior, identity wins. If they persist in new behavior, identity shifts. This is why persistence during discomfort is critical. Identity also influences what a person believes they deserve. Many forms of stagnation are rooted not just in behavior, but in worth perception. A person who subconsciously feels undeserving of more will unconsciously reject opportunities, SAB, teach progress, or settle prematurely. They may not even realize they are doing it because it operates below awareness. Changing identity therefore requires not just behavioral adjustment, but internal permission. Permission to grow, permission to expand, permission to receive more than what was previously normal. Without this internal permission, growth feels like violation rather than expansion. As identity begins to shift, perception of challenges also changes. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once felt impossible begins to feel like development. This is because identity defines interpretation. The same situation can feel like defeat to one identity and training to another. Ultimately, identity is the control center of transformation. It determines whether discipline is temporary or permanent, whether growth is sustainable or fragile, whether change is surface level or deep-rooted. Without identity shift, stagnation eventually returns in another form. But when identity is transformed, stagnation loses its foundation. The final breakthrough occurs when a person no longer tries to act differently, but naturally begins to be different. Not forced before, but aligned behavior. Not temporary change, but established identity. At that point, stagnation is no longer just broken, it is replaced. Because you do not rise to the level of your goals. You rise to the level of your identity.